There comes a moment in every man's life when he faces his deepest fear, that he might be forgotten, that his name will die with him. For Eirik the Unblooded, that moment arrives on the bloodstained shores of 10th century Norway, where plague and war have claimed half his clan. Nearly 40 winters old, with no sons to carry his legacy, Eirik makes a vow that stuns his entire settlement. He will father 5 strong sons by spring's return. His choice of partner shocks everyone. Not a young maiden, but Yrsa, a widowed woman of great size whom others have long dismissed. What begins as a desperate pact for survival becomes something deeper. 2 outcasts discover that strength comes in many forms and that love can bloom even in the harshest winters. But can their union truly create the impossible miracle Eirik has promised? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and Eirik Thorson stood at the edge of his world, watching the sun struggle through grey clouds that had dominated the sky for 3 moons running. Behind him, the village of Raven's Hollow stirred to reluctant life, smoke rising from fewer hearths than the season before, fewer voices calling across the muddy paths between longhouses. The runestone stood 10 paces from where he waited, its ancient surface carved with the bloodlines of his people. Eirik's eyes found his father's name, Thor the Bold, etched deep in granite alongside the names of 5 sons. Below that, his own name sat alone, unmarked by the small runes that would denote children. No sons, no legacy, just Eirik the Unblooded, as the younger warriors had taken to calling him when they thought him beyond hearing. He touched the leather cord at his throat, feeling the weight of his father's broken sword, the blade that had shattered in Thor's final battle against Danish. Raiders 7 winters passed. The blacksmith had offered to reforge it, but Eirik had refused. Some things, once broken, served better as reminders than tools. Still speaking to stones, I see. Eirik turned to find Gunnar the Red approaching, his beard already grey despite being only 35 winters old. The plague had aged them all before their time, those lucky enough to survive it. The stones listen better than most men, Eirik replied, his voice carrying the weariness that had settled in his bones like winter cold that never fully thawed. Gunnar spat into the mud. Stones won't help you when the Danes return. They'll be back before the snows melt, mark my words, and when they come, they'll find us weak as newborn calves. It was an old argument between them. Gunnar favoured raiding the neighbouring settlements for thralls and plunder to rebuild their strength. Eirik believed their people had seen enough bloodshed, enough loss. But what did his opinion matter when he couldn't even manage the most basic duty of any man worth his salt, continuing a bloodline? Perhaps, Eirik said, but raids require warriors, and warriors require sons to replace them when they fall. We have precious few of either these days. The conversation died, as it always did, when they reached this familiar impasse. Gunnar shuffled his feet, studying the ground with sudden interest. They both knew the bitter truth. Of the 43 men who had survived the plague, only 19 had sons of fighting age. The rest, like Eirik, faced the extinction of their lineage. As Gunnar walked away, Eirik's attention drifted to the sound of laughter, rare and precious as summer honey in these hard times. Near the well, a group of village women gathered around Yrsa Eriksdottir as she drew water for her small household. Even from this distance, her presence commanded attention. Not for beauty in the way men usually measured such things, but for something harder to name. Yrsa stood a full hand taller than most men, her frame broad and solid as a ship's mast. Where other women might diminish themselves in the presence of warriors, she moved with quiet confidence, her voice carrying clearly across the morning air, as she shared some tale that set the other women giggling like girls. She had been widowed. 3 winters passed when the plague took her husband Olsen, a decent man who had worked the forge until fever claimed him. Since then, she had managed alone, tending her small garden, caring for the elderly, and somehow always having enough food to share when others went hungry. The village children followed her like ducklings, drawn to her warmth and the stories. She told of heroes and monsters, of love that conquered death and wisdom that defeated armies. But Yrsa knew what the men said about her when they thought no one listened. Too large, too old, too set in her ways. At 32 winters, she had passed the age when men looked for wives, especially men seeking to build dynasties. The young maidens, slender as birch trees and fresh as spring morning, they were the ones who drew attention during the harvest celebrations and winter gatherings. Still, there was something about Yrsa that caught his attention whenever she was near. Perhaps it was the way she listened when others spoke, her dark eyes reflecting understanding that went deeper than mere hearing, or the gentle strength in her hands as she tended the sick, never flinching from pain or sorrow that sent others fleeing. She had delivered half the babies born in Raven's Hollow these past 5 years, her presence bringing comfort to mothers who might otherwise have faced their trials alone. Eirik, the voice belonged to his Aunt Astrid, the only family. He had left, and one of the few people who dared speak plainly to him. She approached with the careful steps of someone whose bones remembered too many hard winters. "The council meets at midday." He nodded, though his stomach clenched at the thought. The council meetings had grown increasingly difficult as the settlement's problems mounted and solutions grew scarce. Food stores running low, too few hands for the spring planting. Raiders reported moving along the coast. And always, the underlying question that no one dared voice directly: who would lead them if something happened to the current generation of warriors? "What will you tell them?" Astrid asked. Her weathered face creased with concern. "The truth," Eirik replied, "that we endure as our people always have. And if they ask about your future, about heirs..." The question hung between them like a blade waiting to fall. Astrid had raised him after his mother died in childbirth with what would have been his younger brother. She had never married, dedicating her life to caring for others' children when her own womb proved barren. She understood better than most the weight of a bloodline's end. "Then I will give them the same answer I always give," he said. "That the gods will provide if such is their will." But even as he spoke the words, Eirik felt their hollowness. The gods, it seemed, had turned their faces from Raven's Hollow. The plague, the failed harvests, the raids, all pointed to divine displeasure. And what displeased the gods, more than a warrior who could not fulfill the most basic requirement of manhood? The morning wore on with its familiar rhythms. Eirik checked the fishing nets with old Magnus, whose hands shook too badly now to work. The boats, but whose eyes could still spot the silver flash of herring beneath the waves. They spoke little, finding comfort in shared labor that required no explanation or justification. By the time the sun reached its weak zenith, the council had gathered in the great hall, a generous name for what was really just the largest surviving building, its roof patched with whatever materials could be scavenged, and its walls bearing scars from the fire that had claimed half the settlement 2 winters past. Eirik took his place among the other men, noting how many chairs sat empty. Gunnar occupied his usual seat, flanked by his 3 surviving sons, young men with fire in their eyes and hunger for glory that reminded Eirik painfully of his own youth. Beside them sat Bjorn the Wise, whose silver tongue had kept them out of more conflicts than his sword had won. The remainder were mostly older men, veterans of too many battles, who now spent their strength holding their families together rather than seeking new conquests. The discussion began, as it always did, with practical matters: food distribution for the remainder of winter, repairs needed before spring, plans for planting season. But gradually, inevitably, the talk turned to larger concerns. "Word comes from the south," Bjorn announced, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome news. "The Danes grow bold again. They've hit 3 settlements along the coast, taking thralls and burning what they couldn't carry." Murmurs rippled through the assembled men. They had hoped for another year of peace, time to rebuild their strength and numbers, but the world beyond their fjord cared nothing for their hopes. "How long before they turn their attention to us?" asked Eirik the shipwright, whose expertise in building vessels made him invaluable despite his advancing years. "Difficult to say," Bjorn replied, "but we must assume they know of our reduced circumstances." Reduced circumstances. A polite way of saying they were easy prey. "Then we should strike first," Gunnar declared, rising to his feet with the energy that had made him feared in battle. "Hit them before they're ready. Take what we need to see us through." "With what men?" Bjorn countered. "We can barely patrol our own borders, let alone mount raids against prepared enemies." "We have enough," Gunnar insisted, "and we have the advantage of knowing these waters better than any outsiders." The argument that followed was both predictable and futile. They all knew the numbers. They all understood their limitations. But acknowledging weakness felt too much like surrender, and none of them were ready for that bitter surrender. Finally, all eyes turned to Eirik. As the son of their former leader, and one of the few remaining men of fighting age who commanded universal respect, his voice carried weight in these discussions. The irony was not lost on him that his opinion mattered precisely because he had no sons of his own to bias his judgment. "Gunnar speaks truth about our knowledge of these waters," Eirik said carefully. "But Bjorn speaks truth as well about our numbers. We are strong enough to defend what is ours, but not strong enough to take what belongs to others. Not yet." "Then what do you propose?" Gunnar demanded. "That we sit here like sheep, waiting for slaughter?" Eirik was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of expectation from every man in the hall. These were his people, his responsibility, whether he had asked for it or not. They needed hope, needed something to believe in beyond mere survival. "I propose we prepare for the future," he said finally. "Not just the next raid or the next winter, but the generations to come. Our strength lies not in our swords alone, but in our children, in the bloodlines that will carry our names forward when we are dust." "Pretty words," Gunnar said with barely concealed contempt. "But children take years to grow into warriors. What do we do in the meantime?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. What indeed? Eirik looked around the hall at the faces of men who had trusted him with their futures, and felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settle on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. But then his gaze fell on the narrow window that faced the village well, and through it he could see Yrsa helping old Sven carry a heavy water bucket to his dwelling. She bore the weight easily, her movements graceful despite her size, her attention focused entirely on the elderly man's comfort rather than the curious stares of passers-by. An idea began to form in his mind, wild, desperate, perhaps foolish, beyond measure. But as he watched Yrsa's easy strength and quiet competence, he felt something he had not experienced in years, the stirring of hope. "Give me 3 days," he said, his voice carrying a newfound certainty that surprised even him. 3 days, and I will provide you with an answer that will secure our future for generations to come." The men exchanged glances, uncertain what to make of this unexpected development. But something in Eirik's manner, a quality they had not seen since his father's time, made them willing to wait. As the council disbanded and the men filed out into the grey afternoon, Eirik remained in his chair, staring through the window at Yrsa as she went about her daily tasks with the unhurried competence that had become her signature. 3 days to find the courage for what might be the most important decision of his life. 3 days to discover whether desperation could transform into hope and whether hope could transform into something even more precious. The broken sword at his throat seemed heavier than usual as he finally rose and stepped into the uncertain light of a world that demanded more than he had ever believed himself capable of giving. The 3 days passed like a fever dream, each sunrise bringing Eirik closer to a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. He spent long hours walking the boundaries of their settlement, testing the words in his mind, discarding them, reshaping them, trying to find some combination that would not sound like the ravings of a man touched by madness. On the morning of the third day, he found himself standing before the ancient altar stone where their ancestors had made offerings to the gods for countless generations. The stone bore stains that spoke of sacrifices both sacred and desperate, blood spilled in hope of favorable winds, successful hunts, protection from enemies. Today, he would add his own offering to that long history. The villagers gathered as word spread that Eirik had something to announce. They came slowly, reluctantly, as people do when they sense that change approaches, whether they welcome it or not. Farmers abandoned their morning tasks. Fishermen secured their nets. Children pressed close to their mothers, sensing the gravity in the adults' faces, even if they could not understand its source. Yrsa arrived with the last group, carrying a bundle of medicinal herbs she had been preparing for old Henrik's persistent cough. She found a place near the back of the crowd, her presence both unassuming and unmistakable. When their eyes met across the assembly, Eirik felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. He had not spoken to her directly about his intentions. The decision had felt too fragile to risk exposing it to another's judgment, too precious to chance seeing doubt or worse, pity in her eyes. But now, with the moment upon him, he wondered if his silence had been wisdom or cowardice. Gunnar stood with his sons near the front, arms crossed and expression skeptical. Bjorn the Wise positioned himself where he could observe both the speaker and the crowd, a diplomat's habit that had served him well in negotiations with neighboring clans. Astrid waited near the altar stone itself, her weathered hands clasped tightly before her as if in prayer. "My people," Eirik began, his voice carrying farther than he had expected in the still morning air. 3 days passed. This council asked for answers to the challenges that face us. We need strength to defend our homes, children to carry our names, hope to sustain us through the dark times ahead. A murmur ran through the gathered villagers. These were familiar concerns, the stuff of every council meeting for the past 2 years. What could Eirik offer that had not already been discussed, debated, and dismissed as impossible? "I have prayed to the gods for guidance," Eirik continued, feeling the weight of every gaze upon him. "I have sought signs in the flight of ravens, in the patterns of frost on the harbor, in the dreams that come in the deep hours before dawn, and the answer they have given me is both simple and profound." He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew his late mother's wedding. A ring, a simple band of silver that his father had placed on her finger in a ceremony, much like the one he now contemplated. The metal caught the weak sunlight, throwing tiny reflections that danced across the faces of the crowd. Our strength lies not in raiding or conquest, but in the sacred bonds that create new life. Our hope rests not in treasures stolen from others, but in children born of love and raised in wisdom. Our future depends not on the swords we carry, but on the promises we make before the gods and the courage to keep them. The murmur grew louder now, edged with confusion and anticipation. Where was this leading? What promise did their leader have in mind? Eirik raised his voice to carry over the growing noise. "By Thor's hammer and Odin's wisdom, by Freya's blessing and the sacred bonds of kinship that tie us to our ancestors, I make this vow before you all. I will father 5 strong sons before the return of spring." The silence that followed was so complete that Eirik could hear his own heartbeat. Somewhere in the crowd, a baby fussed briefly before being hushed. A gull cried from the harbor, but from the assembled villagers, nothing. Then the whispers began, soft at first but growing in volume and urgency. 5 sons before spring? The man was nearly 40, unmarried, and as far as anyone knew, still untouched by woman. How could he possibly fulfill such a vow? Furthermore, Eirik continued, raising his voice above the growing chatter. I call upon Yrsa Eriksdottir to join me in this sacred undertaking, to become my wife and the mother of the sons who will secure our people's future. If the first declaration had brought silence, this one brought chaos. Every head turned toward the back of the crowd where Yrsa stood frozen, her face pale, except for the bright spots of color that bloomed on her cheekbones. The bundle of herbs slipped from her nerveless fingers to scatter on the ground at her feet. The reaction was immediate and predictable, shocked gasps from the women, angry muttering from some of the men. Young voices raised in questions that their elders shushed. But through it all, Eirik kept his eyes fixed on Yrsa, watching as she processed what he had done, what he was asking of her, what it might mean for both their futures. Gunnar was the first to find his voice. "Have you lost your mind?" he demanded, pushing through the crowd toward the altar stone. "Yrsa is—" He stopped himself, perhaps realizing how his words might sound, but the damage was already done. "Yrsa is what?" Eirik asked quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the morning air. A woman of wisdom and strength, a healer who has saved more lives than any warrior's sword, a survivor who has endured losses that would break lesser spirits. Yes, Gunnar, she is all of these things and more. But it was Yrsa herself who broke through the crowd's shocked murmuring, her voice calm and measured despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Eirik Thorsson," she said, her words carrying clearly across the assembly, "this is not how such matters are typically handled." A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the crowd. Trust Yrsa to find the practical heart of any situation, even one as unprecedented as this. "No," Eirik agreed, stepping down from the altar stone to approach her directly. "But these are not typical times. Our people face extinction, and desperate times call for bold action." He stopped a few paces from where she stood, close enough to speak to her directly, but far enough to avoid crowding her in front of the entire village. In his hand, his mother's ring caught the light, a silver promise of the future he hoped they might build together. "I do not ask this lightly, Yrsa Eriksdottir. I know the burden I would place upon you, the challenges we would face. But I also know your strength, your wisdom, your capacity for the kind of love that creates life rather than destroying it. Will you consider my proposal?" Yrsa looked around at the sea of faces surrounding them, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. Her gaze lingered on Gunnar and his sons, reading the calculations already forming behind their eyes. She studied the women who had been her companions and confidants, seeing how quickly circumstance could transform familiarity into something more complex. Finally, her attention returned to Eirik, and in her dark eyes he saw not the immediate acceptance he had hoped for, but something more valuable. Thoughtful consideration. "You speak of 5 sons before spring returns," she said carefully. "Do you understand what you are promising? The gods do not guarantee such things, even to those who seek them with pure hearts." "I understand the risks," Eirik replied. "But I also understand that without hope, without the courage to reach for what seems impossible, we are already defeated. Better to fail in a great attempt than to succeed at nothing." A long moment passed while Yrsa weighed his words, his intentions, the implications of what he was asking. The crowd waited, barely breathing, for her response to this most public of proposals. "Very well," she said at last, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision. "If you truly believe this path offers hope for our people, then I will walk it with you. But understand this, Eirik Thorsson. I am not a young maiden to be swept away by grand gestures. I am a woman with my own mind, my own will, my own conditions." The crowd stirred at this unexpected development. In all their experience, marriages were arranged between families, negotiations conducted in private with careful attention to land, livestock, and lineage. This public declaration, this immediate acceptance, it violated every tradition they knew. But Eirik felt only relief and a growing excitement that surprised him with its intensity. "Name your conditions," he said. Yrsa smiled then, the expression transforming her face from handsome to genuinely beautiful. "That we begin as partners in this endeavor, not as master and servant, that my voice carries weight in our household decisions, and that regardless of whether the gods bless us with 5 sons or 5 daughters or no children at all, we face the future together with honesty and mutual respect." "Agreed," Eirik said without hesitation, extending his hand toward her. "Partners in all things." When Yrsa placed her calloused palm against his, the simple contact sent a shock through him that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. This was no longer just a desperate gambit to save his bloodline. It was the beginning of something entirely new. As the crowd dispersed around them, buzzing with excited conversation about the morning's unexpected developments, Eirik found himself holding his mother's wedding ring, preparing to slide it onto the finger of a woman who represented both his greatest hope and his most terrifying leap of faith. The wedding feast, if it could be called that, took place 3 days later in the Great Hall. What should have been a celebration felt more like a council of war, with the villagers divided into camps that shifted and realigned with each whispered conversation. Some saw Eirik's bold move as inspired leadership. Others viewed it as the desperate act of a man who had finally succumbed to the pressure of his unmarried state. Yrsa moved through the preparations with her characteristic calm efficiency, but Eirik noticed the way conversations died when she entered a room, how eyes followed her with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. The bundle of healing herbs she carried everywhere had grown larger since their public betrothal, and he understood why. She was preparing for the challenges ahead with the practical wisdom that had kept her alive through plague and hardship. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" Astrid asked on the morning of the ceremony, as she helped Eirik arrange his father's ceremonial cloak around his shoulders. The heavy wool bore the scent of cedar and memories, and wearing it felt like stepping into boots too large for his feet. "I've given our people hope," Eirik replied, though he wondered if he was trying to convince his aunt or himself. "You've given them expectations," Astrid corrected. 5 sons, Eirik, before spring. Do you understand the arithmetic of what you've promised?" He understood far too well. Spring was 7 months away. Even if Yrsa conceived immediately, they would be fortunate to see 1 child before the snow melted. 5 sons would require miracles that even the most generous gods rarely granted. "Sometimes faith must come before understanding," he said, adjusting the silver arm rings that marked his status as a clan leader. "Our ancestors crossed unknown seas to reach this land. They didn't know what waited beyond the horizon, but they sailed anyway." Astrid studied his face with the penetrating gaze that had made her formidable as both healer and advisor. "And you believe Yrsa is your unknown sea?" The question hung between them as Eirik considered his answer. 3 days of stolen conversations with his betrothed had revealed depths he had only glimpsed before. Yrsa possessed a sharp intelligence that cut through problems like a well-honed blade, but also a gentleness that could coax life from barren ground. She had survived her husband's death, the plague's devastation, and years of social dismissal with her spirit intact. If anyone could help him navigate the treacherous waters ahead, it was her. "I believe she is my best hope for reaching the far shore," he said finally. The ceremony itself was brief by necessity. Their stores could not support an extended celebration, and the practical demands of winter preparation allowed little time for elaborate ritual. But what the event lacked in grandeur, it made up for in intensity. When Eirik placed his mother's silver ring on Yrsa's finger, he felt as though he was binding himself not just to a woman, but to a destiny whose shape remained hidden in shadow. Yrsa's vows carried the weight of careful consideration. She spoke of partnership and perseverance, of facing whatever storms might come with steady hearts and joined hands. Her voice never wavered, But Eirik caught the slight tremor in her fingers as she accepted the ring, a reminder that beneath her composed exterior lay a woman taking the greatest risk of her life. The feast that followed was a study in controlled tension. Gunnar and his sons occupied one corner of the hall, their conversation punctuated by meaningful glances toward the new couple. The women clustered around the hearth, their voices rising and falling in patterns that suggested intense speculation about the wedding night and its implications. The older men drank quietly, their faces reflecting the skepticism of those who had seen too many grand gestures founder on harsh reality. But not everyone radiated doubt. Old Magnus raised his cup in a toast that brought momentary silence to the hall. To Eirik and Yrsa, he declared in a voice made strong by decades of calling orders over wind and wave, "May the gods bless their union with the children our people need, and may we all live to see their sons grown to manhood." The responding chorus of approval was mixed but genuine, and Eirik felt a flutter of gratitude toward the old fisherman who had chosen hope over cynicism. As the evening wore on and the ale flowed more freely, the conversations grew bolder. Sven, the blacksmith, emboldened by drink and the darkness of the hall's corners, voiced what others had only whispered. 5 sons in 7 months, he said, with the air of a man stating mathematical fact. Even if the woman conceived tonight, the numbers don't favor such ambitions. "The gods work in mysterious ways," replied Henrik the Elder, though his tone suggested he found those ways more mysterious than miraculous. "Indeed, they do," agreed Thorgun, Gunnar's eldest son, his words carrying an edge that made several listeners shift uncomfortably. "Perhaps they'll work so mysteriously that these promised sons arrive fully grown, ready to defend us from the Danish raids come spring." The mockery in his voice was barely concealed, and Eirik felt the familiar heat of anger rise in his chest. But before he could respond, Yrsa's hand touched his arm, a gentle pressure that somehow contained volumes of communication. "The gods favor those who work toward their own salvation," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone. "Promises are easily made, but fulfilling them requires both patience and action. We shall see what the coming months bring." Her diplomatic response diffused the immediate tension, but Eirik could see the calculations continuing behind various eyes. Some were counting days and months, measuring the gap between promise and possibility. Others were weighing the political implications of his success or failure. All were watching, waiting to see whether the desperate gamble of Eirik the Unblooded would transform him into a leader worthy of following or confirm him as a dreamer, unfit for command. The wedding night brought its own awkwardness. 2 adults who barely knew each other attempting to navigate intimacy while the weight of an entire village's expectations pressed down upon them. Yrsa had moved her few possessions into Eirik's dwelling, a process that took remarkably little time, given how efficiently she had organized her solitary life. They sat before the banked fire, the silence stretching between them like a bridge. Neither quite knew how to cross. Finally, Yrsa spoke, her voice soft in the firelight. "This is strange for both of us," she said, stating the obvious, with the directness he was coming to appreciate. "We hardly know each other beyond public encounters and shared concerns for our people." "Yes," Eirik agreed, grateful for her honesty. "Though I feel I know your character, if not your preferences." She smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed her face from handsome to genuinely beautiful. "My preferences are simple enough. Honesty over flattery, respect over passion, though the two need not be exclusive. And the understanding that what we build together must be strong enough to survive disappointment. Disappointment. The possibility that I may not conceive quickly or at all, that our children might be daughters rather than sons, that your bold promise might prove beyond human power to fulfill." She met his eyes directly. "I have learned not to expect miracles even from the gods." Eirik considered her words, recognizing the wisdom born of loss and survival. "Then we'll create our own miracles," he said. "One day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of faith at a time. When they finally came together that night, it was with the careful tenderness of two people who understood that they were building something larger than physical desire, a partnership that would need to weather storms neither could yet imagine. The first month of their marriage brought an unexpected harmony that surprised both Eirik and Yrsa. What had begun as a practical arrangement revealed depths neither had anticipated. Yrsa's presence transformed Eirik's Spartan dwelling into something approaching a home, not through feminine decoration, but through the subtle changes that came with shared purpose and genuine companionship. She rose before dawn to tend the cooking fire, but not from subservience, rather from a lifetime of efficiency that saw no point in wasting daylight hours. Eirik found himself matching her rhythm, using the early morning quiet for weapon maintenance and strategic planning that had previously been neglected in his solitary existence. Their conversations over simple meals revealed compatible minds that approached problems from different angles, yet reached similar conclusions. Where Eirik saw potential conflicts requiring warriors' solutions, Yrsa identified underlying needs that might be addressed through negotiation or compromise. Her insights proved valuable when young Ragnar, Gunnar's youngest son, challenged Eirik's authority during a village council meeting. Perhaps, Yrsa suggested that evening as they discussed the incident, the boy seeks not to diminish your leadership, but to establish his own worth in his father's eyes. Young men often mistake opposition for strength. Her observation led Eirik to approach Ragnar differently, offering him responsibility for organizing the winter hunting parties rather than punishing his outburst. The strategy worked. Ragnar threw himself into the task with enthusiasm that gradually shifted from sullen defiance to grudging respect. But it was Yrsa's untested battle axe that truly captured Eirik's attention during these early weeks. The weapon hung above their hearth, its blade gleaming with oil, but showing no signs of battle use. Unlike the notched and stained weapons carried by the settlement's warriors, this axe remained pristine, a symbol of potential unfulfilled. "It was my father's," Yrsa explained when she caught him examining it one evening. "He died when I was 12, before he could teach me its proper use. My mother insisted I keep it, said it might prove necessary someday." Eirik lifted the weapon, testing its balance and weight. The craftsmanship was exceptional, better than most weapons he had seen, with runes carved along the handle that spoke of protective blessings and sharpened edges. "Have you ever wished to learn? A woman with an axe draws different attention than a woman with healing herbs," Yrsa replied pragmatically. "But there have been nights when raiders threatened our shores that I wondered if knowledge might prove more valuable than appearances." The conversation led to an unexpected development. 3 evenings later, as the sun set behind winter clouds, Eirik began teaching his wife the fundamentals of weaponcraft. Not because he expected her to fight, though he was beginning to suspect Yrsa capable of more than most people imagined, but because understanding violence often proved the best path to avoiding it. She proved a quick student, her natural coordination and inherent strength translating well to martial skills. More importantly, she approached combat training with the same methodical intelligence she applied to healing, studying weaknesses, calculating advantages, planning several moves ahead. "You think like a strategist," Eirik observed after she successfully executed a defensive sequence that had taken him weeks to master in his youth. "I think like a survivor," Yrsa corrected. "The skills are similar." Their growing partnership extended beyond the domestic sphere. Yrsa's knowledge of herbs and healing proved invaluable when sickness struck the settlement in late autumn. Not the plague that had devastated them before, but a wasting fever that left its victims weak and disoriented. While Eirik organized hunting parties to provide nourishment for the sick, Yrsa prepared medicines that gradually turned the tide against the disease. But their success bred its own challenges. Each day that passed without signs of pregnancy added weight to the whispered conversations that followed them through the village. The mathematics of their situation became increasingly stark. 5 sons by spring's return required conception so immediate and fruitful that even the most optimistic began to doubt. Gunnar made no effort to hide his skepticism. Perhaps, he suggested during one council meeting, we should prepare for the possibility that the gods have different plans than our leader imagined. The comment was calculated to undermine confidence in Eirik's judgment, but its effect was blunted by Yrsa's unexpected response. She had begun attending council meetings at Eirik's invitation, a break with tradition that initially raised eyebrows but gradually gained acceptance as her insights proved valuable. The gods' plans often unfold in ways that surprise even the wisest among us, she replied calmly. Perhaps patience might serve us better than premature judgment. Her diplomatic deflection earned approving nods from the older council members, but Eirik could see the strain beginning to show around her eyes. The pressure of public expectation weighed as heavily on her as on him, perhaps more so given the intimate nature of what was expected from her body. That night, as they lay in their bed listening to the wind howl around their dwelling, Yrsa spoke into the darkness with unusual vulnerability. What if we cannot fulfill your promise? What if my womb proves as barren as the winter fields? Eirik turned toward her, though he could barely make out her profile in the dim light from the banked fire. Then we will face that truth together, as we've faced everything else. But your authority, your leadership, it all rests on this vow. If I fail you, you cannot fail me, Eirik interrupted gently. You can only be who you are, do what you can, give what you have to give. The gods will determine the rest. He felt her relax slightly against him, but tension remained in her shoulders. The village women watch me constantly now. They study my appearance for signs, count the days since our wedding, whisper about my age and size, as if these factors might influence divine will. Let them whisper, Eirik said, though he knew the scrutiny wounded her more deeply than she admitted. Their opinions cannot change what will be. But even as he offered comfort, doubt crept into his own thoughts during the long hours when sleep refused to come. Had he allowed desperation to override wisdom? Had he bound himself and Yrsa to an impossible task that would destroy rather than save them? The answer came in an unexpected form 3 weeks later, when Yrsa woke before dawn and rushed outside to empty her stomach behind their dwelling. When she returned, pale and shaken, their eyes met across the dim interior with shared understanding. The gods, it seemed, were not entirely indifferent to mortal promises. One, Yrsa whispered, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat belly. Perhaps the first of 5, or perhaps the only one will be granted. Eirik crossed the small space between them and knelt before her, placing his own hand gently over hers. One is a beginning, he said, and beginnings hold infinite possibility. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song, but inside their dwelling, hope had taken root in the most unlikely soil, a partnership forged from desperation, but growing into something far more precious and enduring. Winter tightened its grip on Raven's Hollow, like a fist slowly closing, and with it came the first true test of Eirik and Yrsa's union. The pregnancy that had seemed like divine favor in its early weeks brought complications that no amount of hope could overcome. Yrsa's morning sickness persisted well past the time when most women found relief, leaving her weak and unable to keep down the nourishment she desperately needed. The ancient fertility amulet that had belonged to Eirik's grandmother, a carved piece of amber containing the fossilized remains of some long-dead insect, now hung around Yrsa's neck, worn smooth by generations of women who had prayed for children. Astrid had presented it to them on the night they confirmed the pregnancy, her weathered hands trembling as she placed the leather cord over Yrsa's head. "This has blessed our family line for 5 generations," she had whispered. "May it bring you the strength to carry what you have begun. But as the weeks passed and Yrsa's condition worsened rather than improved, even the amulet's supposed power seemed inadequate against the harsh realities of pregnancy in a harsh land. She lost weight instead of gaining it, her face growing gaunt, despite Eirik's efforts to find foods that might tempt her appetite. The village took notice, as villages always did. The women who had initially whispered about the impossibility of 5 sons now clucked with different concerns. Would Yrsa even be able to carry one child to term? Some offered genuine help, bringing broths they swore had helped them through difficult pregnancies. Others simply watched with the morbid fascination of those who had predicted failure from the beginning. Perhaps, suggested Ingrid the Weaver during one of the women's gatherings at the communal loom, the gods are showing their displeasure with such ambitious promises. The comment was meant to carry, and indeed it reached Yrsa's ears as she passed by on her way to the well. She said nothing in response, but Eirik saw the way her shoulders stiffened, the careful mask that settled over her features whenever she faced public judgment. That evening, as she struggled to keep down a simple meal of bread and weak ale, her frustration finally broke through her usual composure. "They think I'm being punished," she said, pushing the bowl away with hands that shook from weakness. "That my body's rebellion against this child is divine judgment on our presumption." Eirik set down his own meal and moved to sit beside her. "And what do you think?" "I think," Yrsa said with a bitter laugh that held no humor, "that pregnancy is difficult enough without adding theological interpretation to every symptom." But even as she dismissed the village gossip, Eirik could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. The same woman who had faced plague and poverty with unflinching determination was being slowly worn down by her body's betrayal of her will. The crisis that would test them both came in the darkest part of winter, when the snow lay so deep that travel between settlements became impossible, and the fjord froze solid for the first time in living memory. A messenger arrived on skis, half-frozen and bearing news that sent ripples of fear through the community. Danish raiders had struck 3 settlements along the coast, taking advantage of the harsh weather to launch surprise attacks on communities that believed themselves safe until spring. The pattern was always the same: swift strikes that focused on capturing thralls and stealing stored food, leaving behind burned buildings and grieving families. "They're moving north," the messenger reported to the hastily assembled council, "hitting settlements that are isolated by the weather, taking what they need to sustain their own people through the remainder of winter." Gunnar was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "How long before they reach us?" "Difficult to say," the messenger replied, accepting a bowl of hot soup with grateful hands. "But they know these waters. If the fjord freezes solid enough to support their weight, they could be here within days." The implications were staggering. Raven's Hollow had always relied on the treacherous waters around their settlement for protection, the hidden rocks and shifting currents that made their harbor nearly impossible to navigate for outsiders. But a frozen fjord eliminated that advantage, turning their protective barrier into a highway for enemies. "We need to organize patrols," Gunnar declared immediately. "Set watches on the high ground, prepare defensive positions." "With what men?" interrupted Bjorn the Wise. "Half our fighters are laid up with the winter cough, and those who remain can barely manage the daily tasks of keeping our people fed and warm." It was an old argument with new urgency. Their reduced numbers, adequate perhaps for normal winter challenges, suddenly seemed woefully insufficient for active defense against raiders who chose the timing and manner of their attack. All eyes turned to Eirik, who felt the familiar weight of leadership pressing down on him. But this time the burden felt different, not just the responsibility for making correct decisions, but the knowledge that his choices would affect not only his own future, but that of the child growing in Yrsa's womb. "We cannot fight them in the traditional manner," he said finally, "but we need not fight them at all if we are clever about our preparations." The council members leaned forward, intrigued despite their skepticism. What did Eirik have in mind? Raiders. Seek easy victories, quick strikes that yield maximum profit with minimal risk, he continued. What if we made ourselves appear to be exactly what they expect to find, while preparing surprises they cannot anticipate? Over the next hour, Eirik outlined a plan that drew heavily on Yrsa's insights about human nature and his own understanding of military tactics. Rather than attempting to defend their settlement through force of arms, they would use deception and misdirection to turn the raiders' expectations against them. It's risky, Bjorn observed when Eirik finished explaining his strategy. If it fails, we could lose everything. If we do nothing, we lose everything anyway, Eirik replied. At least this gives us a chance to protect what matters most. The council voted to approve the plan, though not without reservations. As the meeting disbanded and the men filed out into the bitter night, Eirik remained behind with Yrsa, who had listened to the entire discussion with growing concern. You're asking our people to trust in strategy over strength, she said. That takes a different kind of courage than they're used to showing. Yes, Eirik agreed. The same kind of courage you show every day. Facing uncertainty without knowing how the story ends, doing what needs to be done because not doing it means surrendering to despair. Yrsa placed her hand over the amulet at her throat, feeling its familiar weight, and if the plan fails, if the raiders see through our deception, then we'll face that outcome together, as we've faced everything else, Eirik said, though privately he wondered if his confidence was real, or merely another form of desperate hope dressed in reasonable clothing. Outside, the wind howled around, their dwelling with a sound like distant wolves, and the frozen fjord stretched away into darkness that might hide friends or enemies with equal ease. The shared meal bowl that sat between Eirik and Yrsa each evening had become more than simple necessity. It represented the partnership they had forged from unlikely beginnings. Made of birchwood polished smooth by years of use, it bore the small nicks and stains that spoke of countless meals taken together, decisions made over simple food, and the quiet intimacy that grew from facing life's challenges side by side. Tonight, the bowl held a thin stew made from dried fish and root vegetables, humble fare that would have to sustain them through the preparations for what might be their final winter in Raven's Hollow. The plan Eirik had outlined to the council required careful coordination and absolute trust, qualities that had been in short supply before the raider threat made cooperation a matter of survival. The men are struggling with your strategy, Yrsa observed, breaking the bread with careful precision to make it last. Gunnar especially finds it difficult to accept that retreat might be victory. Eirik nodded, having noticed the resistance himself during the day's planning sessions. Warriors were trained to meet enemies head-on, to prove their worth through courage and skill at arms. What he proposed felt too much like cowardice to men who had built their identities around strength and direct action. "And what do you think?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Over these months of marriage, he had come to value her insights more than those of his officially appointed advisors. Yrsa was quiet for a moment, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her belly where their child grew despite the hardships. "I think," she said finally, "that survival requires different kinds of courage at different times. Sometimes the bravest thing is to fight, sometimes it's to run, and sometimes it's to appear weak while preparing to be strong." Her words crystallized, something that had been troubling him throughout the planning process. The success of his strategy depended not just on tactical execution, but on his people's willingness to embrace an approach that challenged their fundamental understanding of honor and courage. "The women understand better," Yrsa continued. "We've spent our lives learning when to yield and when to resist, when to make ourselves small and when to stand tall. It's a different kind of warfare than what men practice with swords and axes." The observation led to a breakthrough that surprised them both. If the women understood the psychological elements of his plan better than the men, perhaps they should play a more active role in its execution, not as fighters, though Eirik had growing respect for Yrsa's developing skill with her father's axe, but as the architects of the deception that would make it work. Over the following days, Yrsa worked quietly among the village women, explaining aspects of the plan that their husbands and sons had struggled to grasp. She spoke to them of the performance they would need to give when the raiders arrived, the careful balance between appearing vulnerable and maintaining readiness to act. "Think of it as theatre," she told Ingrid the weaver and her companions as they worked at their looms. "We must convince dangerous men that we are exactly what they expect to find, helpless victims waiting to be plundered. But beneath that performance, we must be ready for something very different." The women proved remarkably adept at understanding both the subtlety and the stakes involved. They had spent their lives reading the moods and intentions of men whose decisions could mean life or death for their families. Extending those skills to enemies rather than husbands required adjustment of degree rather than fundamental change. But the deception extended beyond human elements. The physical preparation required careful attention to details that might betray their true readiness. Weapons had to be hidden, but accessible. Food stores needed to appear diminished while keeping reserves safe. The settlement itself must look more vulnerable than it actually was without becoming genuinely defenseless. But the implications extended far beyond personal revelation. If the Danes knew of his royal heritage, if they considered him a potential threat to their expansion plans, then his survival and that of his people depended on decisions that no amount of local strategy could address. "How many others know?" he asked, trying to process the strategic implications even as he struggled with the personal shock. "A few of the oldest families remember," Astrid replied, "but most believed the stories were legends, tales told to make our simple lives seem more connected to the great world beyond our borders." Gunnar, who had been studying the captured Danish documents with growing alarm, looked up from the parchments with an expression that mixed respect and fear. "According to these orders, you're not just Eirik the Unblooded anymore. In their eyes, you're Eirik Haraldsson, rightful heir to the throne of Norway and a legitimate threat to Danish domination." The title felt foreign on his tongue, like a garment cut for someone else's frame. But even as Eirik struggled to accept this transformation of his identity, he could see how it changed everything about their situation. The successful defense against Hakon's raiders was no longer a local victory, but the opening move in a much larger conflict, one that would determine not just the fate of Ravenshollow, but the future of Norwegian independence in their region. Yrsa, who had remained silent throughout these revelations, finally spoke with the practical wisdom that had become her hallmark. "Royal blood or common birth, the child I carry is still your heir," she said, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "And if the Danes see our family as a threat, then that threat extends to any sons we might have." The comment brought them full circle to the original promise that had started this entire journey. 5 sons by spring's return. What had seemed like a desperate gambit to ensure the survival of a failing bloodline now appeared to be something far more significant. The potential foundation of a royal dynasty that could challenge Danish expansion. But it also meant that failure to fulfill that promise carried consequences beyond personal disappointment. If Eirik truly was the last heir to Harald Bloodaxe, then the continuation of his line represented the difference between Norwegian resistance and complete Danish domination of their homeland. As the implications of these revelations settled, over the assembled council, Eirik felt the weight of inherited responsibility pressing down on him like an avalanche. He had wanted sons to carry on his name. Now it appeared those same sons might be called upon to carry on a legacy that stretched back through generations of kings and forward into a future that would be shaped by their willingness to claim their birthright. The war horn of the ancients. had not been blown in Raven's Hollow for over 20 years, not since the great storm that claimed 7 fishing boats and required every able-bodied person to work through the night, saving lives from the churning waters. Now, as Eirik lifted the curved bone instrument to his lips, its weight seemed to contain all the history and hope of his people. The sound that emerged when he blew carried across the frozen fjord and up into the mountains beyond. A deep, resonant call that spoke of ancient traditions and desperate necessity. It was the sound their ancestors had used to summon clans to war, to call scattered settlements together when survival required unity over independence. Within hours, the responses began arriving. Smoke signals from the high peaks, messengers on skis from settlements that had received their own warnings about Danish expansion. By the 3rd day, representatives from a dozen communities had made the dangerous winter journey to Raven's Hollow, drawn by both the horn's call and the rumors that had spread faster than wildfire across the frozen landscape. They came not as supplicants, seeking leadership, but as equals, evaluating whether Eirik Haraldsson, the name still felt strange in his mouth, was worthy of the loyalty his bloodline commanded. The revelation of his royal heritage had traveled with surprising speed, carried by traders and messengers who understood that such news could reshape the balance of power throughout the region. "So you're the lost prince," said Olaf Ironbeard, whose settlement controlled the mountain passes that any large army would need to use. He was a man carved from winter itself, tall, broad, and seemingly impervious to cold or comfort. "Your father hid himself well. We had heard rumors over the years, but rumors are cheap as summer snow." "I make no claims to thrones that exist only in memory," Eirik replied carefully. "But I will defend what my people have built, and I will stand with any who choose to resist Danish occupation." The negotiations that followed were unlike anything Eirik had experienced. These were not village councils debating practical matters, but discussions that would determine the fate of entire populations. Each settlement leader brought their own concerns, their own capabilities, their own demands for what they would require to commit their people to a war that might cost them everything. Yrsa proved invaluable during these talks, her insights into human nature helping Eirik navigate the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and fears that shaped each leader's decision. She had grown visibly larger during these weeks, her pregnancy now unmistakable even beneath the heavy winter clothing that all of them wore for warmth. "The child grows strong," she told him one evening as they reviewed the day's negotiations. "Sometimes I feel as though he's eager to join the world we're trying to build for him." "He?" Eirik asked, noting her choice of words. Yrsa smiled, one hand resting on her rounded belly. "Call it intuition, but I believe this one will be a son. Whether the first of 5 or the only one we're granted, he deserves to inherit a world worth living in." The sentiment was shared by many of the settlement leaders, who found themselves convinced not just by Eirik's royal bloodline, but by the evidence of his ability to inspire hope in desperate times. The successful defense against Hakon's raiders had demonstrated tactical competence, but it was his marriage to Yrsa, the partnership they had forged and the child she carried, that spoke to his understanding of what they were truly fighting to preserve. But unity came with its own challenges. The combined resources of the allied settlements were formidable, but coordinating their efforts required careful planning and absolute trust. Each group brought different strengths. Olaf's mountain fighters knew the terrain better than any. Map could show. The coastal settlements possessed boats that could move supplies and men faster than overland travel. The inland farming communities could provide food stores essential for a prolonged campaign. The strategic planning consumed long days and sleepless nights. Eirik found himself drawing on every lesson his father had taught him about warfare, supplemented by insights that seemed to emerge from bloodline memories he had never known he possessed. Sometimes, in the midst of planning sessions that stretched deep into the night, he would find solutions to tactical problems appearing in his mind as if placed there by ancestors who had faced similar challenges. "You think like a king," observed Sven Crow-Eye, whose reputation for strategic thinking made his opinion carry particular weight. Not just about the next battle, but about the war that follows victory, about the peace that must be built when the fighting ends. The observation troubled Eirik more than it pleased him. He had never wanted to be a king, had been content with the simpler challenges of leading a single settlement. But circumstances seemed determined to thrust greater responsibilities upon him, whether he sought them or not. The preparation extended beyond military planning to the emotional and psychological readiness of their people. Many had never fought in organized warfare, had no experience with the kind of disciplined action that would be required to face a professional army. Others had fought before, but always in small groups, never as part of a coordinated force involving hundreds of warriors. Yrsa took responsibility for preparing the non-combatants, the women, children and elderly who would need to survive regardless of how the battles went. Her pregnancy did not slow her efforts to organize supplies, plan evacuation routes, and establish communication systems that would keep families informed of their loved ones' fates. "Victory is meaningless if we lose ourselves in achieving it," she told the assembled women during one of their planning sessions. "We must preserve not just our lives but our ways of life, our values, our commitment to caring for each other." Her words resonated deeply with people who had seen too much loss already, who understood that survival without purpose was just another form of defeat. They began to see this conflict not merely as resistance to Danish expansion, but as an opportunity to build something better, a confederation of settlements that could protect each other while maintaining their independence. As winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, the pace of preparation intensified. Scouts reported increased Danish activity to the south, not just raiders now, but organized military units moving methodically northward. The enemy was coming whether they were ready or not, and the time for planning was drawing to a close. The final war council took place on a night when the aurora danced green and gold across the northern sky, an omen that the old men interpreted as favorable for great undertakings. Eirik stood before the assembled leaders, feeling the weight of the war horn at his side and the expectations of hundreds of families who had placed their trust in his leadership. "Tomorrow, we move to meet them," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "Not because we seek war, but because war seeks us. Not because we desire conquest, but because we refuse to be conquered." The response was immediate and heartfelt. Weapons raised in salute, voices lifted in traditional battle cries, the sound of men and women committing themselves to a cause larger than their individual survival. But as the council dispersed and the leaders returned to their final preparations, Eirik remained behind with Yrsa, both of them staring up at the dancing lights that painted the sky in colors no earthly artist could match. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Terrified," Eirik admitted. "Not of death. That comes to all men eventually. But of failing these people who have chosen to follow me, of leaving our son a legacy of defeat rather than triumph." Yrsa took his hand, guiding it to rest on her belly where their child grew strong and restless. "Then remember what we're fighting for," she said. "Not glory or conquest or even revenge. We fight for the right to choose our own futures, to raise our children according to our own values, to build communities based on trust rather than fear." As if responding to his father's touch, the child moved within her womb, a strong kick that felt like a promise of life to come. Eirik smiled despite his fears, feeling a surge of determination that surprised him with its intensity. Whatever the coming battle brought, whatever prices they would be required to pay, this child would be born free. The legacy of Harald Bloodaxe would continue not through conquest or domination, but through the simple human courage to defend what mattered most. Above them, the aurora continued its eternal dance, and in its shifting patterns Eirik thought, He could see the faces of his ancestors, not demanding vengeance or glory, but offering silent encouragement to a descendant who had chosen love over ambition, partnership over power, hope over despair. The cloak Yrsa had woven seemed to grow, heavier as the fighting intensified, not with physical weight, but with the accumulated hopes of everyone who had trusted him with their futures. Every arrow that found its mark, every enemy warrior who fell to allied blades, brought them closer to the victory that would secure their children's freedom. Eirik felt the familiar transformation that came with combat, the narrowing of focus, that made the world shrink to immediate threats and opportunities, the heightening of senses that made every sound and movement significant. But beneath the warrior's concentration, he carried awareness of larger stakes. This was not just another raid or border skirmish, but a battle that would determine whether his people controlled their own destiny or became subjects of foreign rulers. Sven Snakeeye proved his reputation by adapting quickly to the changed circumstances, but his adaptations came too late to prevent significant losses among his forward elements. The disciplined columns that had marched north with such confidence found themselves fragmented into smaller units struggling to maintain formation against enemies who appeared and disappeared like shadows. But it was the psychological impact that proved most devastating to Danish morale. Professional soldiers were trained to face enemy armies, to calculate odds, and respond to predictable tactical situations. What they encountered instead was a coordinated network of fighters who seemed to emerge from the landscape itself, who knew every rock and tree and hidden path as intimately as the rooms of their own homes. The first phase went exactly as planned. Hidden archers emerged from concealed positions among the rocks and trees, their arrows striking Danish formations that had expected to face minimal resistance. Mountain fighters descended from positions that should have been impossible to reach, attacking supply lines and rear formations that had considered themselves safely removed from combat. But as the Danish forces moved into position, they triggered the carefully prepared response that Eirik and his allies had spent weeks perfecting. What appeared to be a single settlement's desperate defense was actually the coordinated action of a dozen communities whose combined strength far exceeded what any enemy scout could have anticipated. The Danish response was immediate and predictable. Their commander, a veteran named Sven Snakeeye, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had preceded his army northward, ordered his forces to deploy in the classical formation that had served them well in dozens of previous conquests. Infantry in the center, supported by archers whose arrows could reach targets at ranges that made conventional charges suicidal. Cavalry on the flanks, ready to exploit any breakthrough or pursue fleeing enemies. "Signal the others," Eirik ordered, raising his father's war horn to his lips. The sound that emerged was different from the calling horn he had blown weeks earlier, sharper, more urgent, carrying the desperate music of men about to risk everything on a single gamble. The battle plan they had developed during weeks of preparation seemed sound in theory, but Eirik knew that no strategy survived unchanged once blood began to flow and men started dying. Their allied forces were hidden in positions that would allow them to strike from multiple directions when the Danish army committed to attacking what appeared to be a much smaller defending force. The distinction was crucial to their strategy. A smaller, more mobile force could be defeated through superior knowledge of local terrain and coordinated tactics that used the enemy's speed against them. But it also meant that failure here would not end Danish expansion. It would merely delay it until a larger, more prepared army could be assembled. "But not as large as they could have been," Eirik replied, noting details that spoke to both Danish strength and limitations. "They move fast, travel light. This is a strike force designed for quick conquest, not a garrison army prepared for prolonged occupation. They're larger than our scouts reported," observed Gunnar, who had positioned himself at Eirik's right side despite their past disagreements. The prospect of foreign conquest had united them in common cause, their personal rivalry subsumed by the greater threat they faced together. Now, as he studied the approaching enemy through eyes that had learned to see terrain as a weapon and position as destiny, Eirik felt the cloak's weight as both burden and blessing. The child growing in Yrsa's womb had begun to move more frequently in recent days, as if sensing the tension that filled every adult conversation. Whether son or daughter, this child would inherit whatever world emerged from the violence that was about to unfold. "This carries the love and prayers of every person who calls you leader," she had said, fastening the clasp at his throat with fingers that lingered on the task longer than necessary. "Wear it not as armor for your body, but as protection for your spirit when the darkness of battle threatens to consume your purpose." Yrsa's protective cloak, woven from the finest wool their settlement could produce and embroidered with protective runes by every woman in Ravenshollow, hung around his shoulders like a tangible reminder of what he fought to preserve. She had presented it to him that morning as he prepared to leave their dwelling, her hands steady despite the knowledge that this might be the last time they touched. The Danish army appeared on the southern horizon like a dark stain spreading across the white landscape, their disciplined columns moving with the methodical precision of professional soldiers who had conquered territories from Ireland to the Baltic. Eirik watched them approach from his position on the ridge that overlooked the valley where they had chosen to make their stand, and felt his heart hammer against his ribs with a rhythm that matched the distant sound of marching feet on frozen ground. The turning point came when Sven Snake-Eye made his fatal mistake, attempting to retreat to higher ground where his disciplined formations could regain their advantage. But the high ground belonged to Olaf Ironbeard's mountain fighters, who had spent 3 days positioning themselves in positions that commanded every approach and escape route. What had begun as tactical withdrawal became systematic destruction, as the Danish forces found themselves trapped between coordinated attacks from above and below. The professional army that had seemed so formidable in open battle proved vulnerable when forced to fight on terrain chosen by their enemies, against opponents who treated every rock and tree as an ally. But victory came with its own horrors. Eirik found himself face to face with Sven Snake-Eye near the crest of the ridge, where the Danish commander had made his final stand. The enemy leader was younger than expected, perhaps 35 winters, with the same kind of quiet competence that Eirik recognized in himself. In different circumstances, they might have been allies rather than enemies. "You fight well for a people who were supposed to be farmers and fishermen," Sven said, leaning heavily on his sword as blood seeped from wounds that would prove mortal. "Whether the battle ended in the next few minutes or hours, we fight for our homes," Eirik replied, his own blade steady despite the exhaustion that made every movement an effort. "That gives strength beyond mere training." Sven studied him with the calculating gaze of a professional warrior evaluating an opponent. "You're him, aren't you? The Lost Prince, Eirik Haraldsson." The use of his true name in this context, spoken by an enemy commander who was dying from wounds received in battle, gave the title a weight it had never possessed during council meetings and strategic planning sessions. This was what royalty meant, the responsibility to stand between his people and those who would destroy them, regardless of personal cost. "I am Eirik, son of Thor, husband of Yrsa, father of the child she carries," he said. "If that makes me a prince, then I accept the title, but only if it serves my people's needs." Sven smiled despite his pain. "Your father chose exile over a crown. You've chosen to fight for one. The gods must find that amusing." "I've chosen to fight for my family's future," Eirik corrected. "The crown, if it exists, is just a tool for protecting what matters most." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of celebration from the valley below, where Allied forces were securing the last pockets of Danish resistance. The battle was over, won at a cost that would take days to fully calculate, but seemed mercifully lower than anyone had dared hope. As Sven Snake-Eye died with the dignity befitting a warrior who had fought well for causes he believed in, Eirik felt the weight of victory settling on his shoulders like Yrsa's protective cloak. They had won this battle, secured this temporary safety for their people, but larger questions remained unanswered. The ride back to Ravenshollow took half a day, during which Eirik found himself constantly scanning the horizon for signs of additional Danish forces. Victory in one battle did not end the war, merely postponed its next phase. But as they crested the final ridge that overlooked their settlement, he saw something that made all the strategic concerns fade into temporary insignificance. Smoke rose from every chimney in Ravenshollow, not the thick, dark smoke of buildings, set ablaze by enemies, but the clean, steady smoke of cooking fires and warmth. People moved between the dwellings with purpose rather than panic. Children played in the spaces between buildings, their laughter carrying clearly in the cold air, and standing in the doorway of their home, one hand resting on her now prominent belly. Yrsa waited with the patience of someone who had never doubted that this moment would come. "The baby moved constantly during the fighting," she told him as he dismounted and crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. As if he knew something important was happening and wanted to be part of it. Eirik asked the same question he had posed weeks earlier, but with new urgency born of the day's revelations about legacy and responsibility. Yrsa confirmed with a smile that transformed her weather-beaten features into something approaching beauty. "I'm certain now, our first son, ready to be born into the world you've helped secure for him." The new life cradle that sat in the corner of their dwelling had been carved by Olaf Ironbeard's eldest son during the weeks of preparation for battle, a gift from one settlement to another, representing the hope that had motivated their alliance. The wood bore intricate patterns that told the story of their people, ships crossing unknown seas, families building new homes in harsh lands, communities joining together to face challenges too large for any single group to overcome. As Eirik knelt beside the cradle and ran his fingers over the carved patterns, he realized that this simple piece of furniture represented everything they had fought to preserve. Not just the right to exist, but the right to build, to create, to pass on something better to the children who would inherit their choices. "One son," he said softly, though loud enough for Yrsa to hear. "Whether the first of 5 or the only, one we're blessed with, he'll be born free." Outside, the celebration continued as their people marked not just military victory, but the confirmation that their way of life would continue. Inside their humble dwelling, 2 people who had begun as strangers, bound by desperate necessity, prepared to welcome the child who would embody all their hopes for the future. Spring came early that year, as if the gods themselves were eager to see new life flourish in the land that had witnessed so much struggle and sacrifice. The ice on the fjord cracked and shifted with sounds like distant thunder, and the first green shoots pushed through the snow-covered earth with a determination that reminded everyone of the resilience that had carried them through their darkest. Winter, Yrsa's labor began on the morning when the first merchant ship of the season appeared on the horizon, a vessel flying Norwegian colors and carrying news that would reshape their understanding of the larger world beyond their fjord. But as the ship approached their harbor, Eirik's attention was focused entirely on the small dwelling where his wife struggled to bring their child into the world. "The pains come stronger now," Astrid reported, emerging from the birthing room, with the calm efficiency that had helped dozens of women through this same passage. "It won't be much longer." Eirik nodded, though his hands shook slightly as he carved another protective rune into the doorframe, a habit that served no practical purpose, but gave him something to do with the nervous energy that coursed through his body like summer lightning. Outside, he could hear the voices of people going about their daily tasks with the renewed vigor that came from surviving threats they had not been certain they could overcome. The merchant ship had docked by the time Yrsa's cries reached there. Crescendo, and its captain, a weathered man named Court the Far-Travelled, waited respectfully outside the dwelling with news that he claimed would interest Eirik greatly. But no message from the outside world could compete with the sound that emerged from the birthing room as dawn gave way to full morning, the strong, lusty cry of a healthy newborn. "A son," Astrid announced, her voice carrying clearly despite her advanced years. Strong lungs, good color, eager to make his presence known to the world. When Eirik finally held the child, wrapped in soft wool and still bearing the mysterious expression that all newborns carried from whatever realm they had traveled from, he felt something shift deep in his chest. This tiny person represented not just the continuation of his bloodline, but the justification for every choice he had made since that desperate morning when he had promised 5 sons by spring's return. "One son," Yrsa said weakly, but with unmistakable satisfaction, her face pale but radiant as she watched her husband cradle their child. Not 5, perhaps, but perfect in every way that matters. "One son," Eirik agreed, though even as he spoke the words, he noticed Yrsa's hand moving to rest on her belly with a gesture that had become familiar over these months of pregnancy. "Unless the gods have more surprises in store for us." The surprise, when it came, arrived in the form of Court the Far-Travelled's news rather than additional children. The merchant captain had travelled the length of the Norwegian coast, carrying word of a development that would affect every settlement from the Arctic Circle to the Danish border. "King Magnus has returned from exile," Court announced when Eirik finally emerged to hear his report. Harold's nephew, legitimate heir to the throne, back from England with Norman allies, and a claim that even the Danish king dare not ignore. The news struck Eirik like a physical blow. Magnus the Good. He remembered the stories of Harold's nephew, the young prince who had fled to England when the old king fell at Stiklestad. If Magnus had indeed returned to claim his inheritance, then the careful balance of power that had made Eirik's small victory possible was about to shift dramatically. "He seeks the loyalty of all Norwegian nobles," Court continued, "especially those with blood ties to the old royal house. Word of your victory over the Danish raiders has spread far beyond these fjords, Prince Eirik. Your name is spoken in halls. From Trondheim to Oslo, Prince Eirik. The title that had felt so foreign when spoken by a dying enemy now carried different weight when offered by a messenger from the restored kingdom. But as he looked around at his people, farmers and fishermen and craftspeople who had risked everything to preserve their way of life, he realized that no distant crown could change what they had built together. "Tell King Magnus," Eirik said, finally, "that Eirik Thorson sends his greetings and his pledge to defend Norwegian independence from all enemies. But tell him also that the people of Ravenshollow have chosen their own path, and that choice has brought us prosperity that no king's favor could improve. The engraved memorial stone that now stood beside the ancient runestone would tell their story for generations to come. Carved by the finest stoneworkers from all the allied settlements, it recorded not just the defeat of the Danish raiders, but the partnership between Eirik and Yrsa that had made that victory possible. The inscription, written in runes that captured both old traditions and new realities, told of a man who had chosen love over ambition, a woman who had chosen partnership over safety, and a child born free in a land secured by the courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. As summer deepened and their son grew strong in the cradle that represented so much hope, Eirik often found himself standing before the memorial stone, reading the story it told and marveling at how different the ending had been from anything he could have imagined that desperate morning when he had made his impossible promise. 5 sons by spring's return, that had been his vow, but as he watched Yrsa teaching their child the first words that would someday become songs and stories, as he saw the allied settlements growing stronger through trade and mutual support, As he witnessed the daily miracles of people choosing cooperation over conquest, Eirik realized that some promises were fulfilled in ways their makers never expected. The legacy he would leave his son was not a crown or a kingdom, but something more valuable: the knowledge that ordinary people could shape their own destiny when they had the courage to dream beyond their circumstances and the wisdom to build those dreams on foundations of love, trust, and shared commitment to something larger than themselves. And if the gods chose to bless them with more children, whether 4 additional sons or daughters or any combination the future might bring, those children would inherit not just their parents' blood, but their conviction that the greatest victories were won not through conquest, but through the daily choice to create rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down, to love rather than merely survive.